What happens when we turn negative messages inward? We've been talking about negative thought patterns, and we've looked at several cognitive distortions and negative thought patterns that we have and how they impact us. But what happens when we turn it inwards? What happens when it's about us? This time, I'm talking about the inner critic. You may know the inner critic, the voice that is inside your head that is telling you things about yourself that, of course, they're not true. But these words are so familiar to you and they've been around for so long that even you believe them. And sometimes what I find is that we believe that we are saying these things about ourselves and we never stand back often and look at the messages and wonder, is this true? Is this thing that I've said about myself true? I've been saying this thing about myself for so long, but is it true? And so often the voice of the inner critic drowns out our own positive voice. The voice of the inner critic will drown out the voice of God, and it will convince you that the way you think about yourself really is true and that is who you are. So I'm going to talk about the inner critic, what happens when we turn this message inward. Now, the inner critic is also the voice of contempt, self-contempt that we take on. So there's this internalized contempt that we have for ourselves, and it tells us things like, you are not good enough. You are not good. You are no good. As well as you're not good enough, you are no good. Oh, you might say this on a whim when something happens. I'm so stupid. And you think that that's a one-off, but I bet you say it around several things in your life. You might say it about yourself at work. You might say it about something that you do at home. You might say it if you're making your favorite meal and you've invited friends over and it burns. And I think that sometimes things like that happen. I'll have a dish that I make it at home and it's perfect and my family loves it and I love it. And then I'm deciding to take it to add to the potluck and that thing never comes out right, you know? And so sometimes I will take it and try my best to not apologize for my dish because I know it's still going to taste nice. And sometimes, the struggle though to not apologize because I'm battling with the inner critic, like I will not give you airtime. I am not going to say I'm stupid. I'm not going to say I always make mistakes, and I'm not going to say anything negative about my cooking, you know? But sometimes we don't, and we call ourselves stupid, or it affects our self-worth, the inner critic. So that's the negative thought patterns that we turn against ourselves. Of course, the others that we've looked at is about sometimes situations and circumstance, but this is about us. This is about me. This is how I feel about myself. And this inner critic affects your self-esteem. It really, the inner critic really goes up against what God says about you. Because the truth of what God says about us is that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And he says that he has plans for us. He says that we're the apple of his eyes. He says all these amazing things about us, but the inner critic says, well, none of that's true because you're stupid, because you always make mistake, because remember the family that you're from, therefore you are not good enough because you're from this family. The inner critic says that all of your accomplishments means nothing. And the inner critic will encourage you to not celebrate your accomplishments. Have you ever heard of people with done amazing things, but it's nothing? Compliments are dismissed. Are you the person who dismiss compliments, not acknowledge your accomplishments and your achievements, really minimize the accomplishments and achievements and don't see them as anything because the inner critic is alive and well telling you that, well, that's nothing. You don't have much. You've not done much because look at that person. You may have a first degree, but that person has a PhD. That's better. You may have a PhD, but don't celebrate your accomplishments from your PhD because, you don't want to be seen as showing off. The inner critic will say, well, even though you have a PhD, you struggled to get it. And, Sally, who was in your class, they didn't have to struggle. And look, you get this grade, but this person, this is the grade that they got. So the inner critic, there'll always be something that the inner critic will use to belittle your accomplishments and allow you to try to put you in a box that is much smaller, smaller and smaller and smaller. The inner critic will influence you to shrink yourself down to a place where you're barely seen. the inner critic will take your voice and silence you. It will say, you cannot speak on this subject. You don't know enough about it. Who do you think you are? The inner critic will say. And of course, sometimes we battle through those voices and still get ourselves on the platform, still get ourselves in the podium, still write the book, still do the thing, battling the inner critic. But we can silence them once and for all. But before I tell you how we can put this inner critic to bed once and for all and make the voice of God the loudest voice in our ear and listen to only his voice, then, but I'm going to talk some more about what the inner critic does. The inner critic will tell you about your mistakes repeatedly. It will almost be like a record player that is playing, that is on repeat, as your MP3 that is stuck and it's going on and on and on and on and on about that one thing. And it's difficult to silence it. And then it will also challenge your appearance. It will say, well, why do you look like that? How come so and so look better? They look better in that dress. Maybe you shouldn't do that. Maybe you should. The inner critic, there's so many things that it will go after. It will go after your accomplishments. It will go after how you look. It will minimize everything. It will always say, well, there's always the other side of things, you know? The inner critic influences perfectionism and tell you that you cannot possibly do this thing because you're not good enough at it, and you're not perfect. It must be done perfect, you know. So the inner critic will have lots of must and always and shoulds and have tos in your vocabulary, things that are absolutely impossible to do. Yeah. The inner critic, though, will not allow you to think about what is good and true and right and just and good. And so to silence the inner critic, what we do is focus on Philippians 4, verse 8. What's true about this? What's right and what's good? We use things to counter the inner critic, like normalizing things. When you make a mistake, everybody makes mistakes. There's nobody in this world who don't make a mistake. Everybody make mistakes, right? So when you make a mistake, it's as opposed to do all or nothing thinking, like I make a mistake, therefore everything is bad about me, everything is bad about the situation, it's awful. You can, pull that back and tell yourself the truth about the situation. Okay, so I made a mistake. Everything is not bad. Everything is, it's everything can be fixed. We can figure something out. There's always another way. When I say to people, there's always a solution to something, and they said, no, there isn't. There's always a solution. It might not be a perfect solution, but there is a solution to something, right? So if you approach life from the place of, I will make mistakes, because you will. We all will make mistakes. The inner critic tells you that you shouldn't make mistakes. And if you make mistake, therefore you're not good enough. So it traps you in this place of impossibility, because we're all going to make mistakes. I've made several mistakes doing this video, but thank God for editing. We can edit those mistakes, right? And nobody would know if I didn't tell you. So we always make mistakes. We are going to make mistakes rather. And so, but the inner critic will say, well, you shouldn't make mistake, because if you do, that's why the teacher in grade 2, that's why your parents, that's why these people who told you these things about yourself and said you weren't going to amount to anything, that's why they were right, because look at it now, you're making mistakes, right? So we normalize it. Everybody make mistakes. When we make mistakes, that we can fix, there are many things that can be fixed. There's not many things that can't be. Every problem has a solution. The solution might not be perfect, but there's a solution, right? And we tell ourselves what is good and right and true and just and good. And I'm going to end with my favorite verse from Micah. Micah 7 verse 9 says, I will bear the indignation of the Lord until he plead my cause and execute righteousness for me. So that even when our mistakes are things that we do that are sinful, and we know that it goes against who God is and what he desires for our lives and what he wants, even if our mistakes means that we've gone outside of the will of God for our lives, even when it means that we've broken his heart, he says that when we come to him and confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And the verse in Micah 7 that I quote, gives me this image of him being with me even in my mistakes, that he's going to plead my cause for me and he's going to be there for me. So when the voice of the inner critic rise up, tell it what's true. Tell yourself the truth. Now, this is not going to be an easy or a simple exercise that you'll do it one time and you'll never have to do it again. So don't allow yourself to become discouraged or sink into discouragement or to sit with discouragement because you're feeling like, I've done this so many times and I'm still having to do it. You're going to build a muscle around silencing the inner critic and telling yourself the truth. So in order to build that muscle, you're going to have to tell yourself something obtain number of times in order for it to become so ingrained in your life and in your mind and in your thought structures that it becomes now your new normal. But for it to become your new normal, you will need to tell yourself a lot of times in order for it to become your new normal. But one thing I want to leave you with, do not become discouraged in well doing. In due season, you are going to reap the reward of a mindset that is after God's order, that the way he wants you to think about yourself, that is the reward that you will have if you persevere. Do not give up. Continue to challenge those negative thoughts, and the outcome will be a more positive mindset, a more positive way of thinking about yourself, you will be able to quicker challenge the things, the lies that is told to you, the lies that comes up. You'll be able to challenge them faster. And you'll see that also this will affect your well-being, your mindset, your mental health. It will affect your day. You'll be able to see sunshine in places where you didn't used to see it before because you have challenged and tackled those negative mindset and you're becoming free.